My Uncle Richard stood in the middle of grandmother's sitting room and announced his plan to sell our family's entire 89-acre Connecticut estate to a real estate developer, his voice filled with the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of assuming the world belongs to him. He'd been the oldest son, he said, and therefore the property naturally fell to him. It was tradition, family law, the natural order of things. What he didn't know was that our grandmother, Eleanor Hartwick Mitchell, had rewritten her will 5 years ago specifically to prevent him from doing exactly this. And I was about to find out why. My name is Sophia Mitchell Hayes. I'm 34 years old, I work as a museum curator in New York City, and for the past 30 years of my life, I'd watched my Uncle Richard operate under the assumption that his birthright was guaranteed. He was the golden child of the Mitchell family, the oldest son of the oldest son, with all the entitlement that came with that position. My grandmother, Eleanor, had always doted on him, or so everyone had believed. What nobody knew was that she'd spent 5 years watching him squander his own inheritance, take advantage of his younger brother, my father, and position himself to plunder what he saw as the family's greatest asset, the ancestral estate in Connecticut. And 5 years ago, Eleanor had decided she'd had enough. The reading of the will was supposed to be a private affair. My grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 92, surrounded by her quilts and her gardens, having lived a full and extraordinary life. The family, my parents, my Uncle Richard and his wife Catherine, my father's younger brother Thomas and his wife Miranda, and various cousins and extended family members, had gathered at Eleanor's lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd arrived from the city the night before, staying at my parents' home in Stamford. My mother had warned me on the drive over that Richard was in an unusually good mood. He thinks the estate is going to be his, she'd said quietly, keeping her voice down so my father wouldn't hear from the kitchen. He's already been to see a developer. They're offering $8 million for the land. That's impossible, I'd said. Grandmother would never allow that. Your grandmother is dead, my mother had said gently. And Richard is about to learn something that's going to shock him considerably. I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. The lawyer's office was exactly what you'd expect from a Connecticut estate attorney: mahogany paneling, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars. David Carpenter, my grandmother's attorney for the past 30 years, sat behind his desk with the kind of composed expression that suggested he'd been anticipating this moment for a very long time. Thank you all for coming, he'd begun, arranging his papers carefully. Eleanor was very specific about how this reading should be conducted. She wanted everyone who appears in the will to be present simultaneously, so there could be no misunderstandings about her intentions. Richard had been sitting in the front row, his posture relaxed, one arm draped across the back of his chair. He'd look like a man at peace with the universe. Let me read through the primary bequests, David had continued. First, her personal effects, jewelry, artwork, and household items, are to be divided equally among her 3 children, Richard, Thomas, and Patricia. These items are listed in Schedule A and have been appraised. The total value is approximately $1.8 million, so each child receives approximately $600,000 worth of items, or equivalent cash value if they prefer liquidation. Richard had nodded, satisfied. This was expected. Personal effects. The investment portfolio, David had continued, totaling approximately $4.2 million, is to be held in trust for her grandchildren's education. Sophia, Marcus, Jennifer, Andrew, and Thomas Jr. will each receive $200,000 upon graduation from a 4-year university, with an additional $100,000 upon completion of a graduate degree. Any remaining funds at the time of each grandchild's retirement will be distributed equally among all 5 grandchildren. I'd sat up straighter. I hadn't known about this. Nobody had told me I was receiving an education bequest. The real estate holdings, David had said, and the room had gone very quiet. Eleanor owned 3 commercial properties in Manhattan, 1 oceanfront property in Martha's Vineyard, and the primary family estate in Connecticut, consisting of 89 acres and multiple structures. These properties have a combined estimated value of approximately $47 million. Richard had straightened in his chair. This was what he'd been waiting for. The 3 commercial properties in Manhattan have been placed in an irrevocable trust with the Connecticut Land Conservancy, David had said. They will be maintained as affordable housing units in perpetuity. The annual operating costs and maintenance will be covered by the rental income from the properties. Eleanor stipulated that these properties were never to be sold during the next 100 years. She felt strongly about contributing to housing security in New York City. Richard's expression had shifted slightly. That wasn't what he'd expected. The Martha's Vineyard oceanfront property, David had continued, is to pass to Patricia, Eleanor's daughter. She may choose to keep it, sell it, or place it in trust. It is hers to do with as she wishes. Its estimated value is approximately $6.5 million. My Aunt Patricia, sitting to my left, had gasped softly. And finally, David had said, the primary family estate in Connecticut, the 89-acre property known as Hartwick Manor, which has been in the Mitchell family for 73 years, is to pass entirely to Sophia Mitchell Hayes, Eleanor's oldest grandchild. The silence in the room had been absolute. Sophia, David had continued, looking directly at me, Eleanor wanted you to know that she made this decision 5 years ago, after observing carefully how her family has related to this property over time. In her own words, which I'm about to read to you, he picked up a sealed envelope. She felt that you represented the values that had always driven her to acquire and maintain this estate, a love of history, a commitment to preservation, and a genuine respect for the land itself. This is ridiculous, Richard had said, his voice sharp. I'm the oldest son. That property is mine by tradition. By family law. Eleanor would have, and did, David had said calmly. I have multiple documents here confirming her mental clarity at the time of the revision. She met with me on 3 separate occasions, each time reaffirming her intention. She had her primary care physician evaluate her cognitive function. She had 2 independent psychiatrists confirm her competency. This will is airtight, Richard. There is no ambiguity. There is no room for contest. She wouldn't have left it to Sophia, Richard had said, his voice now dangerous. Sophia lives in New York. She doesn't even come to Connecticut anymore. She's never shown interest in maintaining that property. It's insane to leave it to her. That's where I need to stop you, David had said, holding up a hand. Eleanor left a detailed explanation. Shall I read it? He'd opened the sealed envelope and begun to read my grandmother's words aloud. My dearest family, Eleanor's voice had filled the room through her attorney's careful recitation. If you're hearing this, I have passed from this earth, and you are gathered to learn how I have distributed my estate. I want to address specifically why I have chosen to leave Hartwick Manor to my granddaughter Sophia, despite it being a significant departure from family tradition. Richard had sat rigid in his chair. I have observed my family for 92 years, the letter had continued. I have watched my children grow. I have watched my grandchildren develop their characters and their values. And I have become increasingly concerned about what will happen to Hartwick Manor after I am gone. For the past 5 years, I have watched Richard approach this estate with the eyes of a developer. I have listened to him discuss its potential, its unused value, its untapped market opportunity. Richard sees Hartwick Manor as a financial asset to be liquidated. He sees 89 acres of family history as $8 million in developer money. I am not judging him for this, it is simply his nature. But it is not the nature I wish to see steward my life's work. Thomas, my youngest son, has shown kindness and respect for the property, but he has built his life in California and cannot commit to its maintenance. Patricia has her own beautiful home and her own interests. But Sophia, the letter had gone on, has always understood what this place means. When she was a child, she would sit in the library for hours, reading about the history of our property. When she was a teenager, she helped me research the architecture of the house. When she was in college, she came home and spent an entire summer helping to restore the gardens. When she became an adult, she chose a career as a museum curator, a profession dedicated to preservation and conservation. Sophia understands that some things cannot be measured in dollars. She understands that history matters. She understands that land carries stories, and those stories deserve to be protected. Therefore, I am leaving Hartwick Manor to Sophia, with the provision that she may never sell it during her lifetime. If she is no longer able to maintain it, she may place it in a conservation easement, ensuring that it will be preserved in perpetuity. Upon her death, the property will pass to her children, with the same restriction. This is my legacy. This is what I want my life's work to become, not a subdivision of luxury homes or a shopping center, but a place of history and preservation. I hope you will all respect this decision, even if you don't fully understand it. The letter had ended. The room had been silent for a long moment. Richard had stood up, his face flushed with anger. This is theft, he'd said. This is Eleanor punishing me for being successful, for understanding real financial value. This is your mother's will, David had said firmly. And it is legally valid. You have no grounds for contest. Eleanor was fully competent. She was aware of family alternatives. She made a deliberate and informed choice. And I have letters from 3 independent physicians confirming her mental acuity at the time she made this decision. Sophia can't possibly maintain that property, Richard had said, turning to face me. Do you have any idea what the taxes are? The insurance? The maintenance? You make museum curator money. You're going to be bankrupt within 5 years trying to keep that place up. That's where Eleanor has also provided for you, David had said. He produced another document. Eleanor established a trust specifically for the maintenance of Hartwick Manor. The trust currently holds $3.2 million, allocated for property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and conservation. Sophia will receive quarterly distributions from this trust to cover all operational costs. She will never have to pay maintenance expenses out of pocket. He'd passed me the document. I'd stared at the numbers, barely comprehending. Furthermore, David had continued, Eleanor has established a $500,000 endowment for historical preservation and scholarly research related to the property. Any historical society, museum, or university that wishes to study the architecture, gardens, or history of Hartwick Manor can apply for research grants. Sophia will have the authority to approve these grants. She will essentially become the steward of a living historical archive. I'd felt tears beginning to form in my eyes. This cannot be legal, Richard had said. I'm going to contest this will. You're going to lose, David had said, his voice not unkind, but very final. I've already prepared for this eventuality. I have 3 expert witnesses prepared to testify to Eleanor's competency. I have documentation of the multiple conversations I had with her about this decision. I have her own handwritten notes explaining her reasoning. You have no legal grounds for contest, Richard. And frankly, the legal fees for attempting to contest this will would exceed any value you might recover. Eleanor was aware of this and took it into account when structuring the will. Richard had sat back down heavily, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. The rest of the reading had proceeded as David explained the remaining bequests. Richard's siblings had received their inheritances. The family staff had received generous bonuses. Charitable organizations that Eleanor had supported throughout her life had received endowments. Everything had been carefully considered, legally structured, and impossible to contest. When the reading had concluded, I'd remained sitting in my chair, processing the fact that my entire life had just changed. I now owned an 89-acre estate. I now had a trust fund to maintain it. I now had a research endowment. I now had a responsibility that had nothing to do with my career in New York City and everything to do with my childhood dreams of preservation and history. My uncle had left without speaking to me. My Aunt Catherine had followed, her face red with frustration. But my father had come to me and pulled me into an embrace, and I'd felt him trembling slightly. Your grandmother loved you very much, he'd whispered. She always said you were the only one who truly understood what Hartwick Manor meant. She wanted you to know that. In the months that followed, I'd made decisions about my life. I'd transferred my position to the museum's Connecticut satellite office, allowing me to live part-time at Hartwick Manor. I'd hired a property manager to handle the day-to-day maintenance. I'd brought in architects to assess restoration needs. I'd established relationships with historians and conservationists interested in researching the property's architecture and gardens. The trust distributions had begun quarterly, and every expense had been covered without strain on my personal finances. Eleanor had left me not just a property, but the financial means to truly steward it. Richard had attempted, briefly, to contest the will. His lawyers had reviewed the documentation, seen the 3 psychiatric evaluations, read Eleanor's handwritten notes, and advised him that he had no case. The legal fees would be $50,000, and he would certainly lose. He'd dropped the matter. But what had truly shifted something in me was finding Eleanor's personal diary in the library at Hartwick Manor. In it, dated 5 years before her death, was an entry in her careful handwriting, I have decided today to change my will. Richard called again about the potential of selling the property. He doesn't understand that this place is not potential, it is memory. It is history. It is the story of our family written in architecture and landscape. I will not allow it to become a subdivision. I will leave it to Sophia, who understands what I have always known, that some things are worth more than money. That preservation matters. That legacy is not about profit, it is about meaning. 3 years later, Hartwick Manor had been transformed. Not destroyed, but restored. The gardens had been replanted according to my grandmother's original design. The library had been digitized, with rare books catalogued and preserved. The architecture had been carefully restored by craftspeople who understood historical conservation. And the property had become something Eleanor had always envisioned, not a financial asset to be liquidated, but a place of learning and preservation. Universities brought students to study the architecture. Historical societies used the property for research projects. The grounds hosted small academic conferences about conservation and preservation. My uncle Richard had eventually accepted the reality of the situation. He'd never apologized. He'd never acknowledged that Eleanor had been right to be concerned about his intentions. But he had stopped fighting it. He had accepted that some things were not his to take, and that his birthright had not come with the entitlement he'd assumed. And I had learned that the most powerful inheritance is not always the largest one. Sometimes it's the one that challenges you to become the person you were meant to be all along. Sometimes it's the one that says, I see who you really are, and I trust you with what matters most to me. My grandmother had known me better than I'd known myself. And in leaving me Hartwick Manor, she'd given me not just a property, but a purpose. And that, I learned, was worth infinitely more than the $8 million a developer had offered. It was worth a lifetime of preservation. It was worth the continuation of history. It was worth the meaning that Eleanor had worked her entire life to create. And it was entirely mine. The end.